You believe you comprehend time. You strap a timepiece to your wrist. You sense your body aging. You recall yesterday's events and sketch plans for tomorrow. Time appears self-evident, the most intuitive aspect of existence. But that perception, that's merely a sensation, a neurological illusion your brain constructs for survival. Most humans operate with this romantic notion lodged in their consciousness. Time resembles a flowing river. You visualize it streaming forward, carrying you from past through present toward future. You believe it's in motion. But here's where that elegant metaphor collapses entirely. If time functions as a river, at what velocity does this river flow? 1 second per second? That's circular reasoning. That's equivalent to declaring a chair is 1 chair tall. It reveals absolutely nothing about reality's fundamental architecture. The actual truth is far stranger, far more mechanical, and frankly far less poetic than any flowing stream. Time doesn't flow anywhere. Time doesn't propel you forward. And if you assume you've mastered how time operates simply because you can mentally count seconds, you're about to encounter a profoundly uncomfortable awakening. Let's begin with the machinery inside your skull, because that's where the confusion originates. You assume your internal chronometer is a dependable mechanism. It absolutely isn't. It's a chaotic assemblage of translation protocols. Consider this straightforward experiment. Attempt to count to 60 seconds mentally. Just sit there and count 1, 2, 3. You believe you're measuring time, but what you're actually executing is a highly specific, highly personal cognitive program. Some of you, when counting, hear an auditory voice in your consciousness. You're literally verbalizing to yourself, sub-vocalizing 1, 2, 3. If someone interrupts and requests you speak aloud, you lose your count completely. The mechanism jammed, but others, and this is where it becomes fascinating, don't hear any voice whatsoever. They visualize imagery. They might see a measuring tape with numerals scrolling past like a stock ticker. Click, click, click. If you employ that visual measuring tape system, you can actually read a newspaper or scan a grocery list while maintaining your count. You can organize your laundry, examine textile patterns, and still keep that mental tape advancing flawlessly. But the individual who counts with auditory processing, they cannot read a single word without losing temporal tracking. This reveals something fundamental. What you experience as time's passage is simply a mental construction, a pattern-matching exercise your brain executes. It varies dramatically between individuals. It is not a universal constant. It's a biological hallucination. So when we discuss physics, when we examine the universe, we must discard your brain entirely. We must cease discussing how it feels and begin discussing what it actually is. In physics, we must be operational. That means we don't ask what is time's essence, because that's a question for philosophers who enjoy debating over coffee. We ask, how do we measure it? And the answer is almost disappointingly straightforward. Time is simply a method of ordering events. That's it. It's a labeling system. Imagine you possess a deck of playing cards. You arrange them in a sequence. You can state the jack precedes the queen and the king follows the queen. The cards aren't moving. The table isn't flowing. The order is merely a structural property of how the cards are arranged. Time is the table. Events are the cards. When we say time passes, we're simply reading the cards from left to right. This brings us to the most significant error everyone commits. You think time is a container. You imagine the universe is a vast empty vessel, and time is a clock on that vessel's wall ticking away. Even if the vessel were empty, if we removed all stars, all planets, all atoms, all light, you think time would continue ticking, tick, tick, tick. Wrong. This is the Newtonian conception, and it's deceased. Time is not a background stage. Time is a measure of change. If absolutely nothing in the universe changes, no atoms vibrate, no light travels, no energy shifts, then time halts. It ceases to possess meaning. You cannot define a second without a physical process. To mark it, a swinging pendulum, a vibrating quartz crystal, a cesium atom, oscillating. Time is not separate from the universe's contents. Time is a property of those contents. This is where your intuition rebels. You protest. Okay, but surely time acts on things. Time makes me age. Time causes milk to spoil. No, it doesn't. This is a linguistic trap. Time is not an agent. Time doesn't possess hands. It doesn't reach into your refrigerator and sour your milk. Bacteria accomplish that. Chemical reactions accomplish that. Entropy accomplishes that. Time is simply the bookkeeping system we employ to track the rate at which those reactions occur. Saying time did it is like saying inches constructed the house. Inches didn't construct anything. Carpenters did. Inches simply tell you where the walls are positioned. Time is the ruler, not the worker. Let's push this ruler analogy further, because this is where things become genuinely bizarre. If time is merely a ruler we use to measure the distance between events, what happens if the ruler itself is flexible? This isn't science fiction. This is measurable reality. We used to assume that a second was a second anywhere in the universe. If you possessed a clock on Earth and a clock on Mars, they would tick-tock in perfect synchrony. It feels obvious, it feels correct, and it's completely false. The rate at which clocks tick depends on where they're located and how fast they're moving. This is not a mechanical failure of the clock. It is a fundamental feature of reality. Imagine you're driving a vehicle across a giant flat sheet of paper. You can drive north or you can drive east. If you drive purely north, you're making maximum progress in the northward direction. But if you turn the steering wheel and begin driving northeast, you're dividing your speed, you're moving partially north and partially east. You aren't traveling north as rapidly as before because you diverted some of that motion eastward. Now replace north with time and east with space. This is relativity's essence. You are always moving through the universe at a constant speed, but that motion is divided between space and time. If you sit perfectly motionless in your chair, you're dedicating all your motion to moving through time. You're traveling into the future at maximum speed, 1 second per second. But the moment you stand up and walk or board a rocket and fly, you're diverting some of that motion into space. You're moving through space, which means you mathematically must move slower through time. Your clock decelerates, your aging decelerates. You aren't breaking the machine, you're simply changing direction on the map. If you could move at light speed, the universe's maximum speed limit, you would be using 100% of your motion for space. You would have zero motion remaining for time. For a photon of light, time does not pass. It is born and absorbed in the same instant from its own perspective. The universe is frozen. Now you might be thinking, well, I don't feel my watch decelerating when I run for the bus. Of course not. You're too slow. You're a biological snail. The effects are minuscule at human speeds, but they're real. We must program satellites with this mathematics. GPS satellites are moving rapidly, so their time differs from your time. We literally must adjust their clocks. If we didn't, your GPS would be off by miles within a day. There's another aspect of time that deceives us, and it returns to that counting problem, the concept of pattern recognition. We perceive time as possessing a direction, an arrow. Past is fixed. Future is open. You can remember breakfast, but you cannot remember dinner. Why? If physics equations work forwards and backwards, and most of them do, why can't we remember the future? If you film a planet orbiting a star and play it backward, it appears perfectly fine. It obeys all gravity's laws. But if you film an egg falling on the floor and breaking, then play it backward, everyone knows it's fabricated. The yellow yolk doesn't leap off the floor, assemble itself into a sphere, and seal itself inside a shell. Here's the secret. This isn't about time itself. It's about probability. It's about disorder. It is vastly, vastly easier to break an egg than to construct one. There are a billion ways for an egg to be broken. Scattered here, splattered there, shell in 3 pieces, shell in 1,000 pieces. But there is only one specific arrangement where the egg is whole. So as things move, and interact. They naturally stumble from the organized state, few options, to the disorganized state, many options. We call this entropy. And this is the only reason you feel an arrow of time. You're watching the universe shuffle the deck of cards. You started with a perfectly ordered deck, and every second that ticks by is simply the universe shuffling it a bit more. You cannot unshuffle the deck merely by hoping. This means that your sensation of time flowing is actually just your brain registering the increase of messiness in the universe. You're a disorder detector. When you distinguish the past from the future, you're really just distinguishing less messy from more messy. If the universe were in a state of maximum mess, maximum entropy, where everything was evenly distributed and nothing interesting was happening, your brain wouldn't be able to tell the past from the future. There would be no egg to break. There would be no memory to form. In a thermal equilibrium universe, the arrow of time vanishes. So let's return to those people counting in their heads. The ones seeing the tape measure versus the ones hearing the voice. They're both struggling to impose a rigid linear structure on a universe that is actually much more flexible. We construct these mental models, these counting machines, because we need to survive. We need to know when the predator is approaching or when the harvest is ready. We evolved to track duration, but we did not evolve to understand the dimension of time. Our brains are efficient, not accurate. We focus on the now because that's where we exist. But in physics, now is a very slippery concept. If you and I are standing next to each other, our now is effectively identical. But if you're on a planet a million light years away, and you start walking away from me, your definition of now slices through the universe at a different angle than mine. What you consider to be happening right now might be in my future. What I consider right now might be in your past. There is no universal now that covers the entire universe like a blanket. The universe is a block of events, a four-dimensional loaf of bread, and how you slice that loaf depends on how fast you're moving. This is difficult to grasp. It feels wrong. It feels like I'm telling you that up is down. But that's because you're trying to translate the high-level language of the universe into the low-level language of your biology. You're trying to count socks when you should be measuring light beams. When you try to force the universe to fit your intuition, you get confusion. You get paradoxes. But when you let go of what you think time is, when you stop trying to count it like a pile of laundry and start measuring it like a dimension of space, suddenly the equations work. Suddenly the universe makes sense. We're not finished, because even if we accept that time is a dimension and that it stretches and compresses with velocity, there's a much deeper question lurking at the bottom of the well. We talked about measuring time, and we talked about the arrow of disorder, but we haven't discussed the beginning. If time is a measure of change, what happens when you run the movie backward all the way to the first frame? If the universe is expanding and we rewind it, it gets smaller and smaller, hotter and hotter. Eventually, you hit a point where the laws of physics themselves start to melt. You see all our clocks, our atoms, our planets, our light beams, they exist inside the universe. But if the universe itself was born in a moment we call the Big Bang, does it make sense to ask what happened before that? This is the ultimate test of your new definition of time. If time is simply a way of ordering events inside the universe, then asking what happened before the universe might be as nonsensical as asking what is north of the North Pole. It sounds like a valid question grammatically, but geometrically it's gibberish. There is no north of the North Pole. There may be no time before time began. And yet we still have that nagging feeling, that internal counter, that voice counting 1, 2, 3. We desperately want the universe to have a backstory. We want a timeline that stretches back forever. It's hard to accept that the tape measure might just start that the counting machine had an on switch. This creates a friction between our psychology and our cosmology. We are finite beings trying to comprehend the infinite using tools made of meat and electricity. It's a wonder we understand anything at all. Consider the patterns again. The person who sees the tape measure in their head can count while reading because they're using different circuits, visual versus verbal. Physics is the same. Classical mechanics was the verbal counting. It worked for day-to-day stuff. Relativity is the visual tape measure. It allows us to process complex patterns that the old way couldn't handle. We're constantly upgrading our mental software to match the hardware of reality. And the upgrade process is painful. It requires discarding ideas we love, like the river of time. But here's the beautiful part. Even though your intuition is wrong, even though your internal clock is a biological hack, and even though time is a flexible, relative, bendy dimension rather than a strict metronome, it still works for you. You can still boil an egg. You can still meet a friend for coffee at 2 p.m. The weirdness of relativity is hidden under the hood. You don't need to understand the combustion engine to drive the car, and you don't need to understand space-time metrics to live your life. But isn't it better to know? Isn't it better to know that the engine is there? This brings us back to that strange experiment with the counting. Remember the difference between the person who hears numbers and the person who sees them. This is not just a party trick. It reveals a terrifying gap in how we understand the universe. When two people talk to each other about something complex like time or relativity or love, they think they're speaking the same language. They nod. They agree. They say, I understand, but what's really happening? You're running a massive invisible translation scheme. You take the words I say and convert them into your private internal imagery, which might be completely different from mine. I say 1 minute, and I see a clock face. You hear a voice saying 60 seconds. We arrive at the same answer, so we think we agree. But the machinery inside is totally alien. This matters for physics because it exposes the fragility of common sense. Common sense is just the collection of prejudices you acquired by age 18. It's built on your specific internal imagery. If your mental image of time is a tape with numbers on it, you'll struggle to understand how time can bend. If your mental image is a voice counting, you'll struggle to understand how time can be spatial. When we try to teach you about the quantum vacuum or the curvature of space-time, we aren't just giving you new facts. We're asking you to delete your operating system. We're asking you to throw away the tape measure and silence the voice. And that's why it feels so hard. That's why your brain rejects it. You aren't just learning. You're translating against the grain of your own biology.